Hey everyone, welcome. We're doing a deep dive today into Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. It's a really fascinating look at how economic and political freedom are connected.
It's interesting to think about when these lectures were actually given, the late 1950s, right in the middle of the Cold War. So the debates about capitalism and socialism were, well, pretty intense.
Yeah, definitely a different world. But you know what? Friedman's ideas are still incredibly relevant today.
hmm
Like right off the bat, he argues that economic freedom isn't just some, nice bonus. He says it's essential to freedom itself.
And he uses some really powerful examples to drive that point home.
Oh, yeah, like those exchange controls in Britain after World War II.
Right, limiting how much money British citizens could take out of the country.
Yeah.
So even if they wanted to travel, it wasn't that simple.
Friedman argued that those kinds of controls, even if they sound reasonable on the surface, they restrict freedom, plain and simple.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he brings up another example that I find fascinating. The Amish farmers who resisted those compulsory retirement programs.
Yeah, they didn't want to be told when they had to stop working.
Exactly. They saw it as a direct infringement on their freedom to work and provide for themselves as they saw fit. They wanted the choice.
It really highlights how much our personal liberty is tied to economic freedom. Friedman also uses the example of occupational licensing laws.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, he argues that those laws, while often intended to protect the public, can also end up limiting individual freedom.
Because they dictate who can and can't work in certain professions.
Right. It makes you think about all the ways, big and small, that our economic choices are shaped by rules and regulations. Have you ever run into zoning laws that, limit what you can do with your own property?
All the time. It's amazing how many regulations there are.
Or maybe encountered rules that make it tough to start a business?
Oh, for sure. Friedman would say these are all examples of how, even in societies that consider themselves free, economic freedom can be constrained in so many ways.
That's a good point. And that leads us to his central argument. A free market, he says, is a necessary condition for political freedom.
He doesn't say it's the only condition, but a vital one.
Right, a necessary but not sufficient condition. And his reasoning is, well, it makes you think. He says that when economic power is dispersed, like it is in a free market, it acts as a check on government power.
Interesting. And historically, you can kind of see that playing out, right? Look at the rise of political freedoms alongside capitalist institutions in the 19th century.
It makes you wonder, though, could democracy truly thrive in a purely socialist system, where the government controls all the economic activity?
That's a great question. Where would the counterbalance to political power come from?
Exactly. And Friedman takes it a step further. He argues that free markets actually protect our freedom to advocate for radical ideas, even those that challenge the system itself.
That's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is. But in a free market, you have all these diverse sources of funding, right? Newspapers, books, online platforms, all sorts of ventures that might promote, ideas that go against the grain.
He's saying that in a free market, publishers are driven by the profit motive, not necessarily by whether they agree with every idea they publish.
Exactly. If there's an audience, there's likely a publisher. It creates this really interesting marketplace of ideas.
Now, contrast that with a system where the government controls every resource.
Yikes. Right. In that kind of system, those in power get to decide which voices get heard and which ones get silenced.
That's a crucial point about the link between economic freedom and that free exchange of ideas.
Okay, now it's really important to note here that Friedman isn't saying we should just, get rid of government altogether. He's not advocating for anarchy.
Right. He outlines a specific role for government, but it is a limited role.
Exactly. He sees the government as being kind of like a referee.
Setting the ground rules, making sure everyone plays fair.
Yeah, things like maintaining law and order, enforcing contracts, defining property rights, basically creating a stable environment where people can interact and do business freely.
He also sees a role for government in providing, what did he call it, a stable monetary framework.
Right. After all, you can't have a free market if the value of money is constantly fluctuating.
And he acknowledges the need for government to step in sometimes when there are what he calls neighborhood effects.
What are neighborhood effects again?
Situations where what one person or business does impacts others in a way that isn't really captured in market transactions.
Ah.
like pollution.
Ah, right, got it. A classic example.
He recognizes that sometimes government intervention might be needed in those cases.
To protect the common good.
Exactly.
But here's the thing, and this is what I find so interesting about Friedman. He's really clear about what he sees as the limits of government. He even gives a list of 14 specific government activities he considers totally unjustified.
Wow, 14.
Yeah, and you know what? A lot of those activities are still debated today. Things like agricultural subsidies, tariffs. It's amazing how relevant those issues remain.
It really speaks to how far ahead of his time Friedman was and how much he worried about government overreach.
And that skepticism, especially when it comes to monetary policy, is super interesting.
Oh, yeah, he really distrusted concentrated power, especially when it came to money. He wasn't a fan of a rigid gold standard, but also wasn't a fan of giving central banks unchecked authority.
So he was looking for a middle ground.
Right. He wanted a system that limited the potential for, manipulation by either the government or private interests. He argued for having specific rules to govern monetary policy.
Written down, no room for, making it up as you go along.
Exactly. Take away that discretionary power and establish clear guidelines to make things more predictable.
He compares it to the First Amendment. Just like freedom of speech is protected by a general rule, not by deciding each case as it comes up, he thought monetary policy should be governed by clear, predetermined guidelines.
Makes sense. Limits arbitrary decisions and, ensures a level playing field for everyone.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about international trade and exchange rates. This is where his concerns about, economic controls really come into focus.
Right. Balance of payments. He was very worried about balance of payment problems. He thought these problems could tempt governments to, put restrictions on international transactions, kind of like those exchange controls we were talking about earlier in Britain.
And his solution, floating exchange rates?
Exactly. Determined by market forces, not government intervention.
It's interesting. I mean, we often take international trade for granted these days, but...
But anyone who's had to deal with currency exchange or, seen those trade barriers in action knows how important it is to have a system where goods and money can move freely across borders.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more area, education. Friedman had some surprising views on this.
Yeah, surprising and nuanced.
Yeah.
It all goes back to his core principle of individual freedom, right? He recognized that, an educated population benefits everyone.
Yeah.
So government involvement in education, he argued, could be justified because of those neighborhood effects we were talking about.
The idea that educating people creates positive spillover effects for the whole community.
Right. But, and this is where it gets interesting, Friedman makes a distinction between supporting, general education, especially basic literacy and civic knowledge, and subsidizing specialized vocational training.
Like training for specific jobs, doctors, lawyers, that sort of thing.
Exactly. He asked a really thought-provoking question. Should taxpayers be on the hook for skills training that mainly benefits an individual's earning potential? Or should that be a private investment?
It's a great question. Gets to the heart of the debate about government's role in creating opportunities versus, individual responsibility.
And it's a debate that's still going on today. And that's what makes Friedman so fascinating. He was grappling with these big questions that are still very much with us.
Yeah, his ideas really challenge us to think critically about the role of government, individual freedom, and how all of that interacts with the free market.
Exactly. He gives us a lot to ponder, that's for sure.
He really does.
As we dig deeper into Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, his views on discrimination really highlight his broader philosophy about the role of government.
It wasn't just about discrimination, though, right? He was really skeptical about government overreach in general.
Exactly. It all goes back to that principle he lays out, the idea that the ends don't justify the means.
Even if you have a good goal, if you achieve it through coercive means,
you undermine the very foundations of a free society.
So open discussion, persuasion, voluntary cooperation. Those were the only legitimate ways to bring about social change, according to Friedman.
Because for him, coercion and individual liberty just don't mix.
And that leads us right back to the role of government. Friedman said it's essential, but
its power should be limited, carefully limited to specific functions.
He outlined two primary roles for government, right?
Right. First, to determine and enforce what he called the rules of the game.
Essentially creating a fair and level playing field where everyone has a chance to, compete.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about establishing that basic framework for a market economy to function. Things like, defining property rights, enforcing contracts, preventing fraud.
And the second role he saw for government,
To act as an umpire.
to make sure the rules are applied fairly and impartially.
Exactly. He was very clear that going beyond those core functions was a slippery slope.
And he wasn't afraid to call out what he saw as, government overreach. Remember that list of 14 activities he considered unjustified?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of amazing, actually, how many of those activities we're talking about, agricultural subsidies, price controls, tariffs, are still, like, front and center in our political debates today.
It's like he was, looking into the future.
He was. And it shows just how ingrained some of these interventions have become in our economic system.
Now, okay, while Friedman was generally pretty skeptical of government intervention, he did acknowledge some areas where it might be necessary, like what he called technical monopolies.
Right, those situations where, because of technical or economic factors, it actually makes sense to have just one provider of a good or service.
Okay, so think utilities, water, electricity.
Exactly. You wouldn't want to have 5 different companies all digging up the streets to lay down their own water pipes.
So in those cases, Friedman said a purely free market might not be the best approach.
Right, because a private company could, abuse that monopoly power, charge really high prices. So Friedman presented 3 options for dealing with technical monopolies.
Lay on me.
Option 1, private ownership, but with government regulation.
Okay, makes sense. What's option 2?
Public ownership. The government runs the utility directly.
And option 3?
This is where it gets interesting. Private ownership, but without government regulation.
Wait, really? He thought that could work.
He knew it was risky, but he was really, really skeptical of the government's ability to regulate effectively.
So even with the potential for abuse, he thought an unregulated private monopoly might actually be less harmful than a government-controlled one.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but he basically argued that market forces, things like changes in technology, new competitors entering the market, those would ultimately be more effective at keeping a private monopoly in check than, government bureaucrats.
Interesting. It really challenges how we usually think about dealing with those kinds of monopolies.
It does. Now, let's talk about something else we touched on earlier, those neighborhood effects.
Refresh my memory.
Situations where, the actions of one person or business have an impact on others that doesn't get reflected in, like market prices. Think about pollution, for example.
Okay, right. Or like the benefits of a well-maintained park in a neighborhood.
Exactly. A purely free market might not always lead to the best outcome for everyone in those situations.
So Friedman acknowledges there's a potential role for government here.
He does. Things like regulating pollution to protect public health, providing public goods like parks. Those are areas where he saw a possible justification for government intervention.
But even then, he's like super cautious.
Oh, absolutely. He's always stressing the need to weigh the costs and benefits of government action, always be aware of the potential for, unintended consequences.
Because every intervention, has a cost. It limits individual freedom to some degree.
It's always about trying to find that balance, right, between the need for collective action to address certain problems and the importance of protecting individual liberty.
Which brings us to another tricky area. Paternalism. How does someone who's such a strong advocate for individual freedom
reconcile that with the idea that sometimes people need to be protected from themselves?
Exactly.
Friedman admitted that, there are situations where paternalism might be unavoidable, especially when it comes to, children or people who are unable to make responsible decisions.
Protecting children from abuse or neglect, that kind of thing. He understood that sometimes government needs to step in.
Absolutely. But he was very, very wary of expanding that principle too broadly.
Because for him, adults, even if they mess up, should generally be free to learn from their mistakes.
Make their own choices.
It's about respecting individual autonomy, even if, you don't agree with the choices someone is making.
Exactly. Friedman was worried that those paternalistic policies, even when they come from a good place, end up undermining freedom.
And creating a culture where people become dependent on the government.
Instead of taking responsibility for their own lives.
Okay, now I want to switch gears a bit and explore some of Friedman's more controversial views, specifically his critiques of Social Security, his ideas about discrimination, and his arguments against monopolies.
Those are definitely areas where his commitment to individual freedom and limited government gets really tested.
And he offers some, let's just say some unconventional perspectives.
He does. Let's start with Social Security. This is a program that's often seen as like a fundamental part of the safety net. But Friedman, well, he had some issues with it.
Big issues.
It's important to note that he wasn't against, the idea of a safety net. He just thought the current system was flawed, deeply flawed.
Because it's basically a forced savings program, right?
Right. People are required to contribute whether they want to or not.
And he saw that as a violation of individual freedom. He thought people should be able to choose how they save for retirement.
And he was also critical of the way the system redistributes wealth from current workers to current retirees.
Which he saw as unsustainable.
And unfair.
He even proposed a pretty radical alternative.
The negative income tax.
Right, which we talked about in another episode.
He thought that would be a better, more efficient way to help those who are truly in need.
Without all the coercion and redistribution of the current Social Security system.
It was a bold idea. And it definitely sparked a lot of debate about, how best to address poverty and inequality.
Okay, now let's move on to discrimination.
This is where that distinction he makes between positive harm and negative harm becomes really important.
He said the government absolutely has a role in preventing positive harm, which involves, actual coercion or force.
So things like laws against discrimination in housing or employment?
Exactly. Denying someone opportunities based on their race, religion, gender. That's the government protecting individuals from being actively harmed by others.
But he drew a line when it came to what he called negative harm.
Which is essentially the freedom to decide who you want to do business with, even if your reasons are, let's just say a lot of people would find them discriminatory.
It was a very controversial stance. Friedman acknowledged that he found discrimination abhorrent, but
he argued that using government force to try to change people's attitudes was
a violation of individual freedom.
And he actually thought it could backfire.
He believed education and persuasion were better, more effective ways to change hearts and minds.
So he's saying that even if the goal is good, using coercion is the wrong way to go about it.
Right. He thought government intervention in those kinds of private decisions would lead to more resentment, more resistance.
It's a really complex issue. How to balance individual freedom with
social justice.
Exactly. Friedman was basically saying that sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to let the free market work its magic.
He believed businesses that discriminated would eventually lose out to businesses that were more inclusive.
Okay, now let's talk about monopolies. Another area where Friedman's views often ruffled some feathers.
We already touched on technical monopolies, but he also talked about those monopolies that arise from, government policies.
Or collusion between businesses.
Right. And he saw those as very harmful. They stifle competition, they limit choices, and, they usually lead to higher prices for consumers.
And he was especially critical of government policies that create or protect monopolies.
Things like tariffs that restrict imports, licensing requirements that make it hard for new businesses to enter a market, regulations that favor established companies over newcomers.
He thought those policies distorted the market.
And they end up benefiting special interests at the expense of, ordinary people.
So what was his solution?
Get rid of those government barriers to entry. Let competition flourish.
He was a big believer in the power of the free market to keep things in check.
He did advocate for antitrust laws, though, to prevent companies from engaging in anti-competitive practices. But he warned against, overzealous enforcement.
Because he was worried that could stifle innovation.
And ultimately hurt consumers in the long run.
It's about finding that balance, right, between preventing harmful monopolies and
allowing businesses to, operate freely.
This actually ties into something else he was pretty adamant about, pushing back against the idea of social responsibility for businesses.
Which was becoming a popular idea around the time he was writing. This idea that businesses should be concerned with more than just profits.
That they have a responsibility to, society as a whole.
Right. Friedman really disagreed with that. He argued that a business's only social responsibility was to
compete fairly.
Exactly. Without deception or fraud. He thought businesses should focus on, doing what they do best, providing goods and services that people want at prices they're willing to pay.
So no trying to save the world.
He thought that was the role of the government. And even then, he was very cautious about the government trying to impose its values on people.
It's interesting how that debate is still going on today, with businesses facing all this pressure to, address social and environmental issues.
For Friedman, those were political issues.
Yeah.
to be addressed through the political process, not by individual companies.
Okay, I want to shift gears again and talk about occupational licensing. Might seem like a kind of, boring topic, but
Yeah. It's actually fascinating when you think about it from the perspective of freedom and opportunity.
Friedman saw it as like a modern-day version of the medieval guild system.
All those licensing requirements. He pointed out how, even though they're often presented as a way to, protect public safety, they really end up restricting entry into certain professions.
Doctors, lawyers, barbers, even teachers.
The list goes on and on.
And he argued that while, sure, maybe some licensing requirements are necessary.
In most cases, they mainly serve to protect the people who are already in those professions,
By limiting competition.
which allows them to charge higher prices.
So it makes it harder for people to, pursue their chosen career path.
Especially people from disadvantaged backgrounds who might not have the resources to, jump through all the hoops.
It's a classic example of how concentrated benefits often win out over diffuse costs when it comes to government regulation.
Friedman actually had a great sense of humor about this.
Oh.
Yeah, he made fun of how incredibly detailed the curriculum for barbers was in some states.
What, like how to give a good shave?
More like, I think he quoted something about the scientific fundamentals for barbering and the histology of the hair.
Makes you wonder if it's really about protecting the public or if it's just about, protecting the livelihoods of existing barbers.
Friedman argued that, in most cases, certification would be a better, less restrictive option.
So instead of saying you can't do this job at all unless you have a license, just provide information about someone's qualifications and let people decide for themselves.
Empower people with information instead of using government power to, dictate who can work where.
It's really consistent with his overall philosophy, right? Trust individuals, trust the market.
Exactly. Now let's get into another big one. The distribution of income. Always a hot topic.
And this is where his commitment to free markets bumps up against, concerns about fairness and equality.
Friedman believed that in a free market, people should be rewarded.
Based on their contribution.
Right. He had this phrase, to each according to what he and the instruments he owns produces.
So if you create a lot of value, you should be compensated accordingly. Makes sense.
But he also realized that, in practice, this could lead to some outcomes that many people would see as unfair.
Because some people inherit wealth, some people are just lucky. It's not always about, hard work or talent.
He acknowledged that. So how do you reconcile those two things? A belief in free markets,
but also a recognition that life isn't always fair.
Friedman made a distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
He was all about equality of opportunity. Everyone should have a fair shot to succeed, regardless of their background.
And he supported policies that promoted that, right?
Yeah.
Like expanding access to education, making sure markets are open and competitive.
Absolutely. He saw those as legitimate roles for government. But he was much more skeptical about policies that were designed to, engineer equality of outcome.
Especially those that involved, redistributing income.
Right, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. He argued those policies could actually make things worse.
How so?
Well, he thought they could discourage hard work and risk-taking.
Because why bother striving if, the government's just going to take your money and give it to someone else?
Exactly. And he also thought they could create a culture of dependency, where people become reliant on handouts instead of taking responsibility for their own lives.
So instead of focusing on redistributing wealth, Friedman's approach was to focus on creating a system where
everyone has a fair chance to succeed.
A level playing field.
He believed a dynamic and free market, combined with policies that promote genuine equality of opportunity, was the best way to build a prosperous society where everyone could benefit.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, it's really striking how relevant his ideas still are. I mean, these lectures were from the 1950s.
It is pretty amazing. He had this incredible ability to cut through the noise and identify those core tensions that are, they're still shaping our political and economic debates today.
It's like he could see the future or something. Like he knew these big questions about, the role of government, individual freedom, the power of markets. Those debates weren't going away.
Yeah, and that central message that we need to be really careful about limiting government power if we want to protect individual freedom and, allow for a thriving free market. That's more relevant now than ever.
He makes such a strong case for how often these well-intentioned government programs they end up backfiring.
Creating the very problems they were supposed to solve.
Right. He really challenges us to really examine our own assumptions.
To ask, are there regulations that are actually doing more harm than good?
Are we, so used to turning to the government to solve problems that we've forgotten about individual initiative, about, the power of people to come up with their own solution?
He reminds us that freedom is, well, it's more than just an abstract idea.
It's what drives progress, prosperity, all of that.
But it's fragile.
And we've got to be vigilant about protecting it.
We can't be complacent. We got to be wary of concentrated power, whether it's in the hands of the government or big corporations.
And when you think back to some of the specifics we talked about, like those agricultural subsidies, tariffs, the way Social Security is structured, those were all examples, in Friedman's view,
of how good intentions can lead to, well, some pretty bad unintended consequences.
He argued those policies often end up hurting the very people they were designed to help.
They distort markets, they create inefficiencies, and, maybe most importantly, they undermine personal responsibility.
And remember that part where he talks about how some people get this, sense of satisfaction from seeing the government redistribute wealth?
Oh, yeah. He really pushed back against that.
He said, look, it might feel good, but have you considered the actual cost?
He argued that those redistributionist policies often have all these unforeseen consequences.
And it's not just about money, right? It's about freedom, opportunity.
Those things get eroded, too.
So Friedman was basically saying, hey, let's be a little more thoughtful here. Let's really think about the long-term impact of what we're doing.
Don't just go with your gut. Really engage in a thoughtful debate.
Consider all the angles.
And, when in doubt, err on the side of individual liberty. Remember the power of the free market to come up with its own solutions.
Friedman's work really gives us a framework for thinking about these big issues. The role of government, individual freedom, the power of markets. It's all connected.
And, you don't have to agree with all his conclusions, but his ideas really force us to engage with those fundamental questions.
To recognize that, hey, even the best-intentioned policies often involve trade-offs. There are always costs.
Capitalism and freedom is a powerful reminder that freedom is precious.
We can't take it for granted. We have to actively protect it.
It's a call to, to be engaged citizens.
To be willing to challenge conventional wisdom, to think critically.
And to always be striving for a society that values individual liberty and gives everyone a chance to reach their full potential.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.